So recently I was looking through the comments on my video, What If the Schlieffen Plan Worked? The Schlieffen Plan, if you're not already familiar with it, was Germany's plan to defeat France in World War I by sweeping through Belgium and Luxembourg and capturing Paris. In our own history, the Schlieffen Plan failed due to logistical challenges and some false assumptions made on the part of the Germans, which you can learn about by watching the video on the plan. Regardless, I was looking through the comments on the video and I came across one that made an interesting assertion. The comment reads, "Just a hypothetical, wouldn't going through northern Italy into France be better to keep Britain out of the war?" Oh, YouTube comments section, please never change. So, bearing the total ludicrousy of this military plan, which we'll get to in a minute, would Germany avoiding the lowlands keep Britain out of the war? At first glance, the idea seems far-fetched. And as we unpack the historical context, it only becomes clear why. Britain's entry into the war was never about Belgium alone. As Foreign Secretary Edward Grey famously remarked, it would be quite against Britain's interest if France were to fall. The survival of France was crucial to maintaining the delicate balance of power on the European continent, and Germany's rise as the dominant land power in Europe and its ambitions to challenge the British naval supremacy threatened to upend Britain's balance of power. So even disregarding the recent Anglo-German naval arms race and the Moroccan crises, both of which pitted Germany and Britain against each other, Germany, in any scenario wherein they seek to defeat France, would have made them far too powerful for Britain's comfort, regardless of whether or not the invasion route was through Belgium or through Italy. So from a certain point of view, Belgium was merely the most convenient casus belli for the British pro-war factions to feed the liberals and the British public. The invasion of Belgium provided Britain with the moral high ground, an atrocity narrative that helped rally public support for the war. After all, it's one thing to fight for a small neutral nation under siege. It's quite another to explain to the British public why they should fight to help France retake Alsace-Lorraine, or assist what they saw as an autocratic regime under the Russian Tsar. So if Germany had avoided Belgium, the British government would certainly have had a harder time justifying immediate intervention. However, the reality is that Britain's long-standing policy of maintaining the balance of power in Europe dictated that no single nation could be allowed to dominate the continent, especially not one as militaristic and ambitious as Imperial Germany, and thus Britain's strategic interests would never have permitted them to sit idly by while Germany was given the opportunity to freely crush France and extend its reach to the Channel ports. Again, still suspending our disbelief about the absurdity of an invasion by way of the Alps. Even without the invasion of Belgium, Britain's cabinet, led by Liberal Prime Minister Herbert Henry Asquith, and heavily influenced by the aforementioned Secretary Grey, understood that even in spite of some of their anti-war sentiments on the Liberal side, a triumphant Germany would have meant disaster for Britain's global position. In fact, the conservative minority government had already privately assured the French ambassador that they would back France no matter what, and that Germany's unchecked aggression was too great a threat to ignore. Now, as mentioned, it is possible that, without the invasion of Belgium, Britain might have delayed their entry into the conflict, at least initially. Absent the brutal imagery of German troops marching through Belgian territory, the Asquith government, which leaned anti-war, could have sought mediation rather than immediate mobilization. But in the end, Germany's invasion route, whether through Belgium or northern Italy, was irrelevant to Britain's broader strategic calculus. Again, avoiding Belgium may have postponed Britain's entry into the war, but it wouldn't have prevented it. Britain's fear of a dominant Germany was too great and the stakes too high for them to allow Germany to overwhelm Europe. Now, of course, as the astute observers and historians of my audience will note, all of that is said in total ignorance of the fact that such a maneuver through the Alps would, quite literally, never work. The first and most obvious obstacle would be the sheer geographical difficulty of navigating the Alps. As Austria-Hungary and Italy experienced during the grueling Alpine campaigns of World War I in our own history, warfare in high-altitude mountainous regions is simply hell on earth. A quite cold hell at that. The Alpine terrain is not just rugged, but hostile to humanity, with peaks that soar up to 4,000 meters, steep cliffs, thin oxygen, narrow passes, and glacial valleys that render traditional troop movements almost impossible. Alexander Powell, a writer and observer of the Italian-Austrian front, summed it up well when he said, "On no front, not on the sun-scorched plains of Mesopotamia, nor in the frozen Masurian marshes, nor in the blood-soaked mud of Flanders, does the fighting man lead so arduous an existence as up here on the roof of the world." Historical precedent from the Swabian War of 1499 further reinforces this notion. In this conflict, Swiss forces repeatedly defeated the Habsburg and Swabian armies, despite being outnumbered by a ratio of nearly 1 to 8 in some instances. Without really any training for such terrain as the Italians and Austrians had, and with no clear path to Paris by way of the Alps, the thought of Germany making such a bold and, quite frankly, stupid maneuver is completely and utterly out of the question. But what if all that had somehow changed? What if, in an alternate timeline, the Germans tried to invade France through the Alps? Before beginning today's alternate history scenario, be sure to leave a comment and subscribe. If you want to help contribute to these scenarios, or just have ideas you'd like to have made into videos, consider becoming a channel member or supporting us on Patreon. Thanks, and enjoy the video. So if we assume that the entire German High Command essentially has a brain aneurysm and, instead of following the Schlieffen Plan and invading France through Belgium, choose to push through a neutral country in Switzerland and the treacherous terrain of the Alps in a bid to defeat France, perhaps with the motive to capture French cities like Lyon and create a wide net of German-controlled French territory that they could use to push to Paris, not unlike during the Franco-Prussian War, it's nearly impossible for the offensive to move through Italy, because the Swiss Alps are in the way, and were nearly impassable in World War I, as mentioned. But moving through Switzerland could perhaps be viable if the Germans stayed in the Jura range and avoided the intense terrain of southern Switzerland. All that to say, we're essentially going to tweak the scenario and say the Germans are not going to go all the way down through Italy, because that would essentially be suicidal, but maybe they're going to take the Swiss Alpine route and move through the Swiss plateau, south of the Jura Mountains and north of the Alpine Range. So of course the German High Command would have been completely apprehensive with regard to such an action from the outset. They had been planning and banking on the Schlieffen Plan for years, and the idea of abandoning such a well-established strategy for the gamble of invading through Switzerland would not have been an easy sell. Still, let's assume, for the sake of this hypothetical, that Germany opts for this dangerous stunt. What will be the consequences? Well, for starters, the decision to invade Switzerland would throw the European diplomatic world into chaos. Switzerland had maintained its neutrality for centuries, most recently reinforced by the Congress of Vienna, where major powers including Britain, Austria, Russia, Prussia, Italy, and France agreed that Switzerland would remain a neutral nation. Invading Switzerland would, of course, shatter this balance, alienating any sympathy Germany might have had from neutral parties, including the German-speaking Swiss, who tended to support Germany in our own timeline. Moreover, the Swiss military, while small, were well armed and fiercely protective of their independence. Their militia system and strong national identity, as well as the most obvious problem, Switzerland's terrain, would spell disaster for any German attempts to move through the Swiss mountains. Really, what exactly would Germany hope to gain by cutting through Switzerland? The British will still eventually declare war against them, and on paper, it seems like a logistical nightmare. If we assume that the Germans move through the Jura Mountains, which, while not as formidable as the Alps, would still pose a significant challenge for advancing armies, even if Germany can bypass the mountainous regions of Switzerland, they're still going to face difficult terrain and a population that will still come to fiercely resist their advance within Switzerland. The result would be a grinding war of attrition in the valleys and towns of the Swiss plateau. This would provide France with ample time, up to about 5 whole weeks, to mobilize its forces and set up a wall of defenders along the French-Swiss border. There would be no swift French defeat and then a quick turn towards the east, which is what the Schlieffen Plan was intended to accomplish. Instead, Germany would be stuck on the Swiss Alpine front with no way of rerouting troops to push back Russia, no way of taking Paris, and quite literally nothing to show for invading a neutral country to get to France. Now, as the Germans would push through Switzerland, they would encounter yet another diplomatic quagmire: Italy. At the time, Italy was in a state of neutrality, having declared that it was not obligated to join the war despite being part of the Triple Alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary. A strong sentiment existed within the general Italian population and political factions that Italy should go to war against Austria-Hungary, Italy's historical enemy, although Italy was of course bound by the Triple Alliance. Italians had long-standing grievances with Austria over Austria's possession of majority ethnic Italian territories like the Trentino and Trieste. It was clear that Italian public opinion by the beginning of the First World War leaned heavily in favor of joining the Entente. In our own history, in 1915, Italy negotiated the secret Pact of London with Great Britain and France, who both promised to support Italy's annexing of frontier lands with Austria in return for entering the war on the Entente side. And then on May 3rd, Italy resigned from the Triple Alliance and declared war on Austria-Hungary at midnight on May 23rd. In this alternate timeline, Italy's entry into the war may occur even earlier on the Entente side, given that the mere presence of German troops in Switzerland, which lies along the border with Italy, would have caused an uproar of outcry from the Italian people and ruling class. The Italian army, which had already been in the process of building the Cadorna Line fortifications in anticipation of a potential German attack through Switzerland, would completely ramp up their defenses, and the Italian government would likely pivot immediately toward the Entente, bringing yet another setback to an already overstretched German war machine. But getting back to the task at hand, as Germany would be breaking through the Jura Mountains, battered and exhausted, their gamble to invade France would seem to crumble in real time. Instead of sweeping into France unopposed, the Germans would find themselves staring down the barrels of French artillery entrenched along the rocky landscape of the Swiss border, while British ships would move to meet the Kriegsmarine in the North Sea, with Britain at this point having undoubtedly joined the war, using the invasion of neutral Switzerland as a massive propaganda asset. To make matters worse for the Germans, the Russian army would have mobilized far faster than the German general staff had anticipated. The Eastern Front would see Russian forces advancing into East Prussia and taking control of the Baltic with ease, a huge morale boost for the Russian people and military alike. This would likely also increase the popularity of Tsar Nicholas II, satisfying both the conservative military establishment and the soldiers who would not have to face a brutal and humiliating defeat as they did in our own timeline. Austria-Hungary, Germany's most important ally, would continue to fare poorly. Faced with Russian and Romanian gains, Austria-Hungary would suffer significant defeats on the Eastern Front, and with the Germans fully occupied in their misadventures in the Alps, they'd be unable to send sufficient resources to assist their beleaguered ally. As a result, the Austro-Hungarian defenses would crumble, leaving the eastern portions of the empire completely vulnerable. This particularly would embolden Romania, who sought to leverage their armies to take land from Hungary. Bulgaria, which in our own timeline had joined the Central Powers after witnessing early Austro-Hungarian victories against Serbia, would instead choose to remain neutral. The Bulgarian Tsar and Prime Minister both had decided to declare a policy of strict and loyal neutrality at the beginning of the war, a stance that was popular with both the ruling and opposition parties. Bulgaria's extended neutrality, in turn, would likely prevent the Ottoman Empire from fully committing its forces to the war effort. Without Bulgaria's support and with the Greeks still undecided on joining the conflict, the Ottomans would truly have nowhere really to go, except to fight a treacherous war in the Caucasus with Russia, or to brave the British-controlled Eastern Mediterranean, both of which were particularly unappealing for the empire in decline. As the fronts in France and Switzerland would grow to a bloody stalemate, the situation in Eastern Europe would grow even worse for Germany and its allies. Russian troops would advance deeper into Austro-Hungarian and German territories, exploiting the weakened rear defenses of the Central Powers. With Austria-Hungary's forces essentially all but collapsing under the pressure of Russian and Romanian offensives, the prospect of a two-front war finally would become unbearable for the Germans. By December of 1916, with Christmas only weeks away, the German Empire would sue for peace. In the ensuing treaty, the Entente powers would likely impose harsh terms on Germany in particular. The making of a German scapegoat would be even easier than in our own timeline, as Germany had not just invaded any neutral power, but the neutral fortress of Europe, Switzerland, a country invaded without provocation. Memel and Danzig would be ceded to the Russian Empire, securing its dominance over the Baltic coast. France, on the other hand, would carve out a buffer zone along Alsace-Lorraine. But the real blow to Germany would come as a consequence of its violation of Swiss neutrality, of course. For France and Britain, the decision was clear. Germany could never again be allowed to border Switzerland, a neutral state that had been dragged into a war it desperately sought to avoid. Germany's borders would be drastically reduced, reverting the country to little more than a glorified version of the kingdom which had preceded it in Prussia. Southern Germany, including Bavaria, would be split off and reorganized into an independent state, effectively undoing the unification of Germany that had been achieved in 1871. Austria-Hungary, Germany's primary ally, would suffer an equally devastating fate. The empire would be carved up to satisfy the territorial ambitions of the victors, with a new Czech state created as a buffer on Germany's border, while Slovakia would fall under Russian influence as a puppet state. Russia would seize Carpatho Ukraine, and Romania would be rewarded with major territorial acquisitions in Transylvania. Italy, having entered the war on the side of the Allies far earlier than in our own timeline, would receive significant gains along the Dalmatian coast and in the Trentino region, securing its position in the new European order. Without American intervention, there would be no Wilsonian doctrine of self-determination, leaving the content in the hands of the victorious empires. The new balance of power in Europe would see a Balkanized Central Europe, with the remnants of Germany reduced to fractured, weakened states, far from the unified power that had once been the foremost standing army on the continent. Austria, once the conductor of the concert of Europe and the guarantor of its delicate balance, would now become the architect of its destruction and the victim of its reorganization. The French would likely leverage this new order to attempt to bring the states of Bavaria and Prussia under their economic control and prevent any threat to France from the north again, utilizing war reparations to siphon wealth from the industrial heartland of the Ruhr and Rhine regions. Switzerland's future would remain an interesting point of discussion. Though Switzerland had fiercely defended its independence throughout history, from the wars with the Habsburgs to securing neutrality in the Treaty of Westphalia, its borders had often changed with the tides of European conflict. It's possible that the British and the French would seek for Switzerland's northern and eastern borders to be extended, perhaps seeing the Swiss gain a strip of land along the Bavarian border to further distance it from Germany. However, it's unlikely that the Swiss would accept such an offer, as their priority remained in safeguarding their own internal affairs and maintaining their historic neutrality. And with that, the war was over. Though in actuality it was truly over before it had even started, seeing the Germans make perhaps the most fatal, devastating military miscalculation in history. With the foremost threat to British security having been dealt with, Britain's attention would turn to the east. The Great Game, a century-old struggle between Russia and Britain for influence in Asia, would surely reignite. While Britain and Russia had set aside their differences to fight each other in the Great War, old rivalries often die hard. The British Empire, ever wary of Russian encroachment, would keep a close eye on any moves toward their prized colony in India, while the Russians would remain peering across the Suleiman Mountains at the Raj. Perhaps war would break out between the Tsar and the King. Perhaps revolution would put an end to Russia's advancements. Perhaps the French will finally have dominion over the Germans, or perhaps the flames of nationalism and irredentism will cause Germany to rise up in defiance of this new European order. But let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this video or have any critiques or notes, be sure to leave a comment for the algorithm and subscribe if you want to see more content like this. You can support us on Patreon by following the link in the description or by becoming a channel member with the join button below. Thanks for your time. This has been the US of Z, signing out.